here we go, with an opening slide of the opening gallery to the new permanent collection galleries at the museum. Here we step just inside the gallery and are looking back toward the main lobby of the museum. And several works you see on view there. Just to the left of the doorway is Robert Henry's Jimmy O'Donnell from 1924. This Henry was one of the most influential of American painters in the early years of the 20th century. He was a very charismatic teacher and really a forerunner of modernism in America. A leader of the Ashcan School of Realist Painting in the United States, called the Ashcan School because they focused largely on sort of grittier aspects of city life, while other Ashcan artists focused on like the rural landscapes and cityscapes. Henry really specialized in extraordinary portraits that revealed the psychological insights about the sitters that he portrayed. There's a close-up of Robert Henry's Jimmy O'Donnell of 1924. Jimmy O'Donnell himself, parents worked for Henry and his wife during their summers on Achill Island off Ireland's western coast. Henry was fascinated with the vitality of children and their openness. They inspired many of his very finest works, this being among one of them. Henry painted very rapidly, which you can kind of see from the slashing brushstrokes, very much influenced by an artist such as Northern European Dutch artists such as Frans Hals in this technique. He often would finish a portrait in less than an hour. You can see here the highlights, the strong, rapid gestural brushstrokes capture sort of an energy and a sparkle in this subject. And particularly in the brilliant blue eyes and just attentive expression. Also in the finely rendered, hand of the sitter. Jimmy O'Donnell, he's a really wonderful example of what Henry described as an ideal portrait. And quoting Henry, "The whole canvas should be like a laughing person coming into a room." Next here we see a work by Theodore Robinson, the American Impressionist painter, on the towpath, A Halt, from 1893 to 1894. Again, in some ways, a portrait or rendering of a young man at work.
So this is a major.
And Theodore Robinson himself was born in Irisburg, Vermont, and studied at the National Academy of Design, later at the Art Students League in New York City. He made a number of visits to France and became a close friend of the French Impressionist painter Claude Monet. And you can see in the brilliant lighting of this landscape and the freedom of brushstroke that stretches across the canvas. Robinson was particularly well known for brilliant renderings and in very high sunlight, which you can see in the way that the deep shadows that are cast across the roadway and like down the mountainside, as well as the brilliant blue of the sky, and the way that sunlight just seems to bake and shimmer in this rendering. Robinson was best known for his landscape paintings and genre paintings of village life and rural existence and farm life. And he had numerous exhibitions, both abroad and in the United States. This being a rendering of a young laborer guiding a craft along a towpath, in the sense that this would have been the ropes that you see extending into the the viewer space would have been attached to a boat that was being lugged down the canal by these two horses, like in their harnesses. Another really spectacular work within the collection, quite a large painting that makes it qualify as, in every sense of the word, 19th century history painting, is by William Bradford. This is titled Voyage of the Polaris from 1875. Also, like all the works we're looking at today, was acquired with funds provided by the Horace G. Fralin Charitable Trust. William Bradford was largely known as a maritime painter for his portraits of ships and sailing in the late 19th century. In fact, there is a companion portrait or companion piece that also portrays the Polaris before it was stranded in the ice, as seen in this picture. Bradford was known for his painstaking precision and clarity in the rendering of ships and ocean-going vessels. Also, extremely well respected for his preoccupation with light and atmosphere and times of day. I'm not sure if we lost the image there, but I think it's coming back. There we go.
Well, this is a major work for the artist. It was acquired from a gallery. It has a great story about a ship being trapped in the ice and the rescue of the crew. It's monumental in terms of its scale. And what was especially interesting about this is that Judy was interested in Arctic exploration, what was going on in America. This was done in 1875. And she also knew that this kind of imagery was not only captured in paintings, but also in other types of art, decorative arts. And so she was able to find a silver piece by Gorham that has some of the motifs that you would see here in the painting. And I believe you have that on view as well. Is that?
That is correct. That is correct. So, and yeah, so
there it is.
Yeah.
So a wonderful companion to the painting.
Yeah, great.
Yes, that was Deborah Force, commenting on this major work by William Bradford in the museum's collection, selections from the Horace G. Fralin Charitable Trust gift. Bradford was always intrigued with the challenges of new artistic frontiers through scientific exploration and research. He traveled to New England and the Canadian shores, and even further north into the Arctic area of the Labrador coast. This painting, Voyage of the Polaris, depicts the 1871 ill-fated Arctic exploration vessel that was icebound in the frozen sea of Thank God Harbor off the coast of Greenland. It was en route to its final destination. Captain Francis Hall of the vessel died mysteriously. It was speculated that the ship's doctor had murdered him. And shortly thereafter, the Polaris struck this iceberg. And what we're seeing here is Bradford depicting the desperate moment of action when the 34-man crew was quickly offloading provisions, hopefully to lighten the ship's weight and allow the vessel to become dislodged from its grounding on the iceberg. The crew watched from the frozen tundra as the ship actually capsized. All members of the crew were eventually rescued, but it made for an extraordinarily dramatic painting, and in every sense of the word, in terms of the vastness of the landscape, the depictions of figures, and a moment of great struggle, and it qualifies in the tradition of great history painting. In the academic tradition, all members, as I mentioned, of this crew were eventually rescued, and Bradford did not have direct experience with the Polaris or the site, but he was familiar with the voyage from the many published accounts of its expedition that appeared in the papers at the time. I think next we're going to get, yes, an image by Bruce Crane, India Summer of 1909. Also a vital and contributive member of the American Impressionists. And here, very much like what we saw in the Robinson, sort of a freedom of brushstroke that captures sort of a scintillating light that's cast across the landscape. Indian summer being sort of a fall scene in which the trees have already turned, but the summer weather has once again remained with this landscape, and you get a sense of that sort of both the beautiful foliage of the yellow leaves, but also the fields or landscape with the grasses turning a brilliant golden to match the leaves, but sort of in the haziness of the atmosphere, almost a tonality that gives a sense of the heat on fall afternoon, and the way that light and atmosphere plays across the landscape gives you a rich sense of the vitality and strength of American Impressionist painting in the late 19th and very early years of the 20th century. Another example of American Impressionism, but a little bit more intimate scene, is John Henry Tautman's Wildflowers of about 1890, a few years before the previous painting. Tautman was also one of the most significant and original stylists of the American Impressionists. In the 1870s and 1880s, he studied in Europe, where he was exposed to European and French Impressionism with its very visible brushstrokes and light-saturated imagery. More than any of his American contemporaries, Tautman understood that Impressionism opened the door for experimentation with expressive brushstrokes and very lyrical color harmonies that were not entirely dependent upon their sources in nature. And this is exemplified in Wildflowers, which is nearly abstract in its depiction of both phlox and tiger lilies that were growing in Tautman's garden in Greenwich, Connecticut. And instead of isolating like any one, beautiful flower, Wildflowers sort of emphasizes this sort of profuse abundance within the landscape and within the natural fields, or gardens of the Greenwich, Connecticut region. One of the most familiar and treasured work in the Taubman Museum of Art's collections is John Singer Sargent's portrait of Mrs. George Gribble, familiarly known as Nora. It's painted in 1888. Sargent was born of American parents in Florence and in Italy, and grew up traveling throughout Europe. At 18, he joined the studio of the painter Carolus Duran in Paris, also a great portraitist of the late 19th century in French painting. There he developed a very swift and bold brushwork, so a masterful handling of light and shadow, and a faithfulness to the surface appearance that characterized all of his portraiture. And like his teacher, Sargent was deeply influenced by the painterly style and psychological insight of Velázquez and Frans Hals, both Southern and European traditions in portraiture. And he would have been very familiar with the work of Velázquez as well as Hals through his own travels throughout Europe and his visiting of collections. His burgeoning career in Paris was interrupted in 1884 after he showed a portrait entitled Madame X, which was really a portrait of Madame Gautreau. It's one of the great scandals of 19th century portraiture, in which Madame Gautreau's exhibited bared shoulders in a provocative pose caused in which even the strap of her dress had slipped off of her shoulder. As his commissions declined, he was encouraged by American writer Henry James to settle in England. And in 1887, Sargent spent time at Giverny with Monet, and then made a successful trip to America. This portrait of Nora Gribble was probably done shortly after his return to England in 1888, as his fame was rising quite rapidly. Nora Gribble herself was an artist, a poet, and a writer of spiritual works. Her son, Philip, described his mother in his autobiography, Off the Cuff. My mother, in her lighter moments, was capable of charming flashes of frivolity, but her normal reaction to life was one of intensity. She was a marvelously beautiful woman, blessed with divinely golden red hair and immense, almost violet blue eyes, varying in depth with her moods. Her full, sensitive mouth, firm chin, and small but magnificently carried head were a delight. She held very advanced views, was self-centered, artistic, and intellectual. I think all these traits come through in Sargent's portrait of this quite formidable woman. I think we might have some images of this painting, some X-ray images of this painting, which are interesting primarily because Sargent originally, painted the figure facing straight forward to the viewer, when there are faint traces of her arm that can still be seen to the right of the figure. And it's interesting that at this point in Sargent's career, the figure was turned slightly. One might even think more modest pose, especially in light of the scandal that surrounded his painting of Madame X. One wonders whether there was a little bit, too much sensuality and sexuality conveyed in a frontal pose in such an elegant and gown. But the figure was turned, and scholars also believe that that Japanese silk that forms the background is the same cloth that appeared in Sargent's Lady Agnew of Lucknow of 1892. A magnificent life-size portrait by Sargent. Here we have Child Haslam's Across the Park of 1905. Haslam's views of New York City are among the most significant achievements of American Impressionism of the late 19th century. And this is a view across Central Park in New York City from the Upper West Side, from Central Park West. Actually, we're looking down on what were the old stables of Central Park, where horses were kept for rides through the many bridle paths that twisted through and were built into Central Park. You see the tree-filled park with strollers and horse-drawn vehicles and people riding their horses in the foreground. And you see across the park a few new high-rise buildings that mark the city's transition into the 20th century. But much of the landscape across the park, which would be the Upper East Side, is still relatively low buildings. Writing of Haslam's city scenes, one contemporary critic hailed Haslam as, and I'm quoting here, a brilliant painter, a sort of Watteau of the boulevards, with unlimited spark and gaiety, movement and animation. Haslam's lively style was an outgrowth of his studies in Paris during the 1880s, where he was also inspired by the work of European Impressionists such as Claude Monet. The stable buildings that you see in the foreground, just across Central Park West, would now be Tavern on the Green. Those buildings have been converted a while ago to one of the favorite tourist attractions of the park and places for food and gathering. Here we have a magnificent painting by the American George Ennis called Midsummer of 1875. Ennis was the son of a farmer and the fifth of 13 children. He came from a humble home, was born in 1825 in Newburgh, New York, which is just up the Hudson River from New York City. He received relatively little formal education, but he did briefly study under an artist named John Jassy Barker, and also Francois Guignou in the 1840s. However, his art was most influenced by the Hudson Valley artists Thomas Cole and Asher B. Durand. He reached his maturity as an artist during the formation of the Hudson River School, of which these two men were prominent members. While Ennis is distinguished by his work on the Hudson Valley, he is perhaps best remembered as the most important artist philosopher of his generation. Ennis had great philosophical pursuits, and those were some of his most consuming endeavors. Before his death, he confided that painting had been a mental torment of an immensity that would be inconceivable to others. Quote unquote, Eden was, it will not be again. We must work our way back to that paradise. In his search for clarity and meaning, Ennis destroyed many more canvases than he sold, and many thought him practically insane. A New York Times critic, after being faced with one of Ennis's landscapes, wrote, quote, "We are not sure that Mr. Ennis is quite right in his mind," unquote. And this sort of feedback troubled Ennis relatively little. He viewed his work as a scientific and spiritual process of coming to understand the world and human life. here we have a magnificent painting by Edward Steichen, who is much better known as for his his photography, but he was also a painter and a curator, and one of the most renowned figures of the early 20th century in art. He was a founding member of camera work, more influential in camera work than anyone else during its publication between 1903 and 1917. Alfred Stieglitz, another early 20th century American photographer, hailed him as the greatest photographer that has ever lived. This is a particularly rare example of his painting entitled Cooper's Bluff, Midnight Strollers of 1905, relatively early within Steichen's career, because as his career progressed, he became more and more devoted to the art of photography. But the painting is particularly relevant in the fact that it so brilliantly and uniquely, follows many of the trends of Steichen's photography. This misty landscape, which owes a tremendous debt to the influence of Japanese works of art, particularly Japanese prints, that were very influential within the aesthetics of late 19th century and early 20th century European and American painting. Many examples of the Japanese woodblock and silkscreen prints were collected avidly by American and European painters and studied both for their atmospheric effects as well as for their unique perspectival views of the landscape, in which these shimmering bodies of water and hazy hills and vegetation were uniquely combined for this very atmospheric vision that was often referred to as tonalism, both within photography as well as within painting. But Steichen's photographs also exhibit many of these influences of Japanese art in both the sort of almost out of focus, but highly atmospheric, highly romantic, highly extraordinarily beautiful scenes, which were only matched, possibly by the work of his contemporary Whistler, who is and his influence and his being influenced by Japanese and Eastern art. So, and here we have absolutely gorgeous example of Maria Richard Oakley Dewing's painting called The Rose from 1905. Maria Oakley Dewing was an American painter, known for her depiction of flowers. Actually, this painting is particularly notable for the quality of portraiture that is included along with this image of a single white rose. She was an American that was largely inspired by the work of John Lafarge, painter, as well as glassmaker and main rival of Louis Comfort Tiffany within the American art world. And she's widely known for her love of gardening, and thus, very well known for her imagery of flowers. She also made figure drawings and was a founding member of the Art Student League in New York City. She won bronze medals for 2 of her works at world expositions, and she was married to the artist Thomas Dewey. Maria Oakey, he was born in New York City, the 5th child of William Francis Oakey and Sally Sullivan Oakey. They had 10 children together, of which Maria was the 5th. William was an importer and also interested in the arts, and Sally was a very cultured woman and writer who came from a wealthy family of Boston. Her younger brother, Alexander Oakey, was an architect with, like his sister, an interest in textiles. Alexander Oakey wrote The Art of Life and Life of Art in the mid-1880s. Maria decided at the age of 17 to paint, and in 1881 married the artist Thomas Dewey, whose career at that point was very much less established. After that, she was a little bit more disappointed in her own career as the wife of one of the most prominent figures of the day in American arts, Thomas Dewey. She felt unable to compete with her husband. And at the end of her life, Dewey expressed doubt in her own accomplishments and regret for what she had given up. She, and I quote here, she said, "I have hardly touched any achievement." Thomas and Maria had a son who died while an infant, and in 1885 had a daughter. Here we see, both a combination through the beautiful depiction, the beautiful portraiture, beautiful depiction of fabrics, beautiful depiction of the rose and the flower within the painting, sort of a combination of all of the highlights of Maria's painting. Finally, here we're looking at a portrait by Irving Ramsay Wiles, Portrait of Miss T, from 1910. Wiles was one of the most well-known and most accomplished society portraitists of his era. In many ways, like Sargent, many of his clients were among the wealthiest and most socially prominent figures of New York and New England of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Here you see, also like Sargent, this great devotion to the art of Velázquez in sort of the shimmering brushstrokes and touches of highlights that adorn this black crepe gown. Also, quite daring in its fashion, and at the height of fashion in 1910. Wiles was known, for the spirited characteristics and personalities that come out in his portraiture of many members of high society in the early years of the 20th century. I think that we have a few images of the new installation of these works within the permanent collection galleries at the museum, which we might share with you. Here's the kind of prominent view of the opening gallery of the permanent collections from the 1850s to the 1950s. This room is devoted to all of the works from the Horace G. Fralin Trust that we talked about and looked at today. Most prominently there, Sargent's portrait of Nora Gribble at the end of the gallery. And there may be another view. Yes, well, it gives you a view of that corner of the gallery with the Dewing, the Steichen, the Ennis, the Hassam, the Sargent, and the Tautman. And the other end of the gallery there, which I think we saw at the very beginning of our presentation. And there, beginning with the Robert Henry and ending with the portrait by Wiles. I think we're going to open up for questions. We've run a little bit over, but if there were any questions about this body of work, I would be glad to try to answer them. And but it can be emphasized that, you know, one of the highlights of the museum's collections are these holdings that were acquired through the generosity of the Horace G. Fralin Trust. This body of works, we're seeing about half of the overall gift to the collection today, and we'll have another chance to see another half of the Horace G. Fralin Trust in a future presentation of conversation with the curator. And the other half is mixed in with some other jewels from the permanent collection of the Taubman Museum of Art that actually both help like contextualize and you know, many of these works. What can be said about this particular gallery and this particular collection of works is that no finer quality would ever be found by each individual painters. And many of these are among the most influential and most well-known painters, American painters of the late 19th and early 20th centuries in America. The quality of the works cannot be overstated in many ways. And one of the great you know, treasures of the Taubman Museum of Art is the chance for visitors to actually, you know, see and to enjoy and, you know, benefit from some of the finest examples of American painters by these like extraordinarily influential and well-known artists of the era. And I hope that all will come and visit the museum to see these. I just wanted to say that our next conversation with the curator is going to be on Tuesday, February 8th at 12:30 p.m. with a focus on the Homeward Bound Triennial exhibition that just opened up at the museum. Thank you for joining us today. I very much look forward to our future conversations with the curator, and thank you for being here and I hope you will come to the museum to visit these treasures from the Horace G. Fralin Trust.